How to drive down wages and make a nation poor. We often forget that during medieval times, England and much of the West was quite poor and not that technically advanced. It might be hard to imagine that, when we tour the England and view the castles and cathedrals built during that time. Public wealth was quite high, as it is in the present United States. Much of what wealth there was available to the top social strata alone. Because of industrialization, there is so much wealth it is difficult for the few to grab it all. Wealth is, despite their best efforts, trickling down and has been doing so since the time of the Industrial Revolution. We ought to be aware of the same phenomenon happening in the United States. A country not so much of diversity but of contrasts. The richest country in the world is one of the poorest. But that is because gross domestic product per capita does not equal actual incomes for most people. The US has enough people and machinery to generate a lot of wealth, which it does. But it does not need all its people to generate this wealth. The economy does not need all of its workers to work for top wages. There is a surplus amount of labor which rotates through lower-level jobs, keeping wages low. But before we go further, we need to reveal a truth about communism, socialism, and capitalism. They all have different spellings. Much is made of capitalism's so-called free market. Any enterprising individual can start a business. At least that is the theory. Though, on the flip side, anyone who works hard at gaining the right party affiliations in a communist country is able to gain high office and get on the path to wealth accumulation. The real difference between these systems might not be the difference one expects. The difference between capitalism and communism is the parasitic activity that is rewarded. Capitalism to a greater degree rewards the economic elite, whereas communism reward the political elite. Which brings us to the real issue, which is how wealth is created. It is not by investors nor by the implementation of social agendas, though both get the headlines. We know that while the planet is ideally suited for life, it is not ideally suited for civilized life, it is alien to the life of a civilized society. To tame the wilderness is not easy and beyond many cultures. Civil society requires personal sacrifice and a lot of it. It is not difficult to realize workers do the work. It is in the name. But work has to be organized to be done right. Regardless of whether we work alone or in groups, there is a better and worse way of working. Poorly organized work can, at the lower end, be destructive rather than constructive. But how to organize work, that is the question. Who is to do the organizing? Communists think the state is the best judge of what needs to be done. Capitalists believe individuals are the best judge of what ought to be done, guided by a desire for profits. Both views are wrong, but that is beside the point. Both sides have an agenda to acquire power. It is best pursued using a public/private partnership. The balance of power shifts between the two parties, but the basic partnership continues on, generation after generation. The public and private sphere may be enemies and they may have incompatible objectives, but they need each other. Capitalism could not exist without the state. The state could not exist without some private degree of private initiative. For many eons, even the most powerful of states would allow private citizens to collect taxes as a licensed right. Capitalism minimizes the role of the state compared to private interests, and communists minimize the role of private agents compared to the public ones, but no country can eliminate the state and private interests. There is always this symbiotic partnership present in every state. That being said, private and public elites do not produce things, both operate as brokers. The state acts as a broker between different social groups. Capitalists act as a broker between workers and consumers. This is the crucial fact that must be remembered. Elites produce nothing regardless of whether they are left or right elites. They specialize in making things happen because they have power over the dispensation of assets. The state controls everything the military can defend. The military serve as the large-scale, blunt instrument of power. The police and judiciary are the more fine-tuned instruments of justice. However, they are essentially reactive attempts to keep disorder within reasonable limits. Remembering, the right of the state to wield power is the first principle of justice. At least in the mind of the state. Basically, power is wielded to protect the power of those who have the power. The nature of justice has been an interminable problem, however. Since man left Eden, justice has been a blunt-edged and reactive sword. Basically, the state articulates the law of the jungle. The law of the jungle can be summed up in two aphorisms. The law of the jungle is summed as might makes right and the end justifies the means. The state holds the sword because the military has the final say. Short of that, it is the courts which enforce the law, using whatever force is necessary. Few of us question if the law of the jungle ought to prevail. Women in weaker races have convinced the stronger males to give them a voice, but such accommodation is always conditional. No barriers exist between the weak and the strong. Only a tactical decision by strong males to give the weaker a voice has given us liberalism, feminism, and die. Justice requires power, and the state makes a point of maintaining a monopoly on power. However, power is not exercised in a vacuum. Power needs property. In fact, there is a close and intimate relationship between property, power, and justice. Those who would have power or enforce justice needs property because it is through the control of property that power is exercised and justice implemented. This understanding begs the question of how do we obtain justice if the power used to implement justice is grounded in the law of the jungle? Justice needs authority over property, but is justice no more than the rule of the jungle formalized into regulatory provisions? Anyone can make a law or form an opinion, but it takes armed men willing to use force to enforce it. However, it is true to say that mankind is the author of his own misfortune. We exited Eden under the shame of sin, and we have been under the authority of our own kind since. But what is justice that it is treated like a product of nature? The world has turned justice upside down. The world has manipulated power to effect justice, but how can we have justice if power is the reward for justice? To have justice is to have power. Justice is ownership equal to the property one created. Justice assigns power to those who have earned it and to those who deserve it. Justice does not assign property according to a social agenda. Justice is not producing the outcome one wants and gets because one has access to the reins of power. Yet this is precisely what is behind all social agendas and government in general. But herein lays the problem. It is not possible to have a king rule over you, unless the king has a social vision and an agenda to implement it. The king has no sense of justice, unless he intends to bring this vision about. Without an agenda and a commitment to it, he is a ruler in name only. To be the state is to have an agenda implemented in the name of justice, but the justice of the state is a justice which holds the vision of the leader in the highest regard. Which brings us to the question of what justice is. We have concluded that property is needed to have power and power is needed to implement justice. To ask what justice is to ask who has the right to the property that enable the exercise of power. Most people naturally think property is something that can be seen and felt. Such is not the case. We are thinking of ourselves as God when we think we can own the physical world or part thereof. There is no possible path to man's ownership of what belongs to God. That, in case one is not aware of it, is everything physical created by God. That does not leave much for humans to claim as their own. But there is a path laid out by God to give man ownership. It is narrow and hard to find because it does not include any part of physical reality, but the option to own what we create does exist. The common view is that the universe is ideally suited for life. It is, with one proviso: Earth is not that suited for human life, at least not if we wish to live in a civilized way. To live a human life, we need to modify the environment to suit us. As God said, "By the sweat of our brow shall we live." We have to work. Work adds value to the things of God. If value is not added to the things of God, you are not working. If you are working, you deserve compensation. It is the value added to the things of God that belongs to us. That and only that is the justice promised us by God. The worker is worthy of his wages, not the state, not a human being. We are not worthy by virtue of our birth or our mother's love. We are worthy because we work, and we have added value to the things of God. Therefore the worker has the power because the worker produces the property. The only possible justice is to ensure the worker is worthy of his wage. To do otherwise, to sacrifice the worker for the sake of a parasite, and that is inherently unjust. When we have many earning, but few working, there is downward pressure on wages. When there are people who eat but do not work, the one working will not get all the wages to which he is entitled, and this ultimately will make the nation poor.